Good morning, men and women of Christ. Glad to be back with you with part 3 of this spirit-led teaching. Christ is the forgiveness of God. It is so important for us to know this because forgiveness is an eternal work that's carried out in us so that through us can be manifested the fruits of forgiveness, which is the first fruits of the righteousness of the law, which is the first fruits of the righteousness of the law, which is Christ. We begin as we end with the last teaching, Galatians 5:1. Stand fast in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free. He made us free from sin when he forgave us from sin. And he forgave us from sin when he saved us from sin. It's all wrapped up in one. Your salvation, in your salvation from sin is your forgiveness from sin. In your forgiveness from sin is your freedom from sin. Now, when we were freed from sin, we were freed from everything that sin had us bound to all the spiritual deception that sin had us bound to, because we were bound to the flesh, but we were deceived in the flesh. So let us go to Galatians 3:27-28. Galatians 3:27-28 tells us what we were set free from. What were we set free from? What deceptions were we set free from? Let us go to Galatians 3:27-28. 27 says, this 27 says, for as many of you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. Now, once we put on Christ, we put on the forgiveness of God. When we put on the armor of God, we put on the forgiveness of God, because Christ is the forgiveness of God. Have put on Christ. 28, where there is neither Jew nor Greek. We were saved from that racial identity. We were saved from the deception of race, from the deception of so-called white love, so-called black love, which is nothing more than lust disguising itself as love, because there's no such thing as a black person or a white person. So therefore, there is no such thing as white love or black love. That's a deception, because race in and of itself is a deception. We being in that fallen state, we were deceived into thinking, in that fallen state, when sin bound us to the flesh being the form of the spirit, Satan through our fallen spirit had us thinking race was a thing of the flesh, when it's actually a fallen identity of the spirit. And the thing about race, it's already been judged to death. Your blackness, your whiteness, it's already been judged to death under the law. You have to be saved from your whiteness or your blackness. You cannot be saved in your whiteness or your blackness. You see, that's race is something you have to be forgiven for. You're saved from race, the religion of race, the politics of race, and the way of race, which is the culture. Every culture that claims to be Christian is operating in the falsehood, in false Christianity, because culture and Christ don't mix. There is no such a thing as a white Christian or a black Christian. That is not a true Christian. A cultural Christian is a false Christian, where there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither bond nor free, there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female. There's neither male nor female in Christ. Male and female is in the flesh, but man and woman is in the spirit. You see, in that fallen state, Satan had us thinking our malehood was our manhood and our femalehood was our womanhood. He had us thinking our sensual nature. He had us thinking our sensual nature was our sexual nature. But once we fell from Christ, we became sexually dead. We could be sensual, but we couldn't be sexual. See, only the man and the woman can be sexual. That's to have intimacy. And only the male and the female can be sensual. That's to have physical interaction, which Satan has deceived into thinking that was intimacy. But once we're back in Christ, we're back in manhood and womanhood. We're no longer in that fallen state limited to malehood and femalehood. Now, we can separate our manhood from our malehood, and you can separate your femalehood from your womanhood. And once that happens, you can separate your gender from your sex, because they're not the same. In that fallen state, Satan had us thinking our gender was our sex. Okay, so if your gender was not your sex, if your gender is not your sex, and it's not, so until you got born again, you were deceived into thinking you were having sex when you actually weren't. You were just having physical interaction, but you weren't having sex, because the flesh can't be sexual. It can only be sensual. Once born back into Christ's spirit through that marital union, which is Christ, because Christ is the gift of marriage, only then do you have the spiritual ability as a man or a woman being sexually alive to have sexual intimacy with your mate in Christ. Other than that, you can't have it. So this is the deceptions that we're saved from. This is the deceptions that we're saved from. In Christ, there's neither male nor female, because the male and female is flesh. In Christ is the man and the woman. That's the man and the woman. Okay. So when we got saved, that's what we got saved from. Where there is neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither bond nor free, there's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. We can't be one in the flesh. There's no such thing as racial unity. There's no such thing as gender unity. We are all one in Christ. We are all one in the mind of Christ. Galatians 6, 7 and 8. Galatians 6, 7 says, for they that sow to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But they that sow to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Let's start again. I jumped the gun. 7 says, that be not deceived, God is not mocked. 8 says, for they that sow to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but they that sow to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. What does it mean to sow to the flesh? To sow to the flesh means you're following the letter of Christ. You're walking by sight. What does it mean to sow to the Spirit? You're in the gospel of Christ. You're walking by faith. 2 Corinthians 5:7 says we walk by faith, not by sight. Faith is the forgiveness of God. Because whatsoever is not of faith, which is freedom from sin, which is forgiveness from sin, which is liberty from sin, whatsoever is not of faith is sin. And sin is unforgiveness. Sin is unforgiveness. So this is so crucially important for our spirit to be born back into the mind of Christ's spirit. And Christ's spirit is the mind of God, because God is the spirit. So that we can walk, according to Ephesians 3:19, we can walk in all the fullness of God. We can walk in all the fullness of what he paid for us to have. And the financial and material good of the world is going to follow. It is going to follow. So this is what we look like to the world. The world is in the deception of race. The true Christian manifesting into this world of darkness will expose race, because Ephesians, the very book of Ephesians, as we go to it right quick, Ephesians 5 says, for you were sometimes darkness, but now are you light in the Lord. Walk as the children of light. Okay. 9 says, for the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. 10, proving, discerning what is acceptable unto the Lord. And 11 says, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove it. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove it. Race is an unfruitful work of darkness. It is the mind of death. It is the mind of sin. And when you're operating in the mind of race, you're operating in the mind of unforgiveness. Because the mind of sin, which is Satan, has already been judged to death. It's already been judged to death. And this brings us to a conclusion of part 3 of this teaching. It's a blessing to bring these teachings to you, and I know they will be a blessing to you because the forgiveness of God is in them, and the freedom of God is in them, and the salvation of, because this wisdom, in this wisdom is the salvation of God. In this wisdom is the salvation of God. Love you with the love of Christ, and see you next time.